the morning coffee is like one of the most important parts of the day. We can either drink that coffee, again, distracted, yelling at our kids, making a list of stuff we need to do that day, or for even just 1 or 2 or 3 sips, we can slow down, feel the warmth of the coffee on our tongue, feel and detect the taste, feel it going down our throats, feel ourselves swallowing it. We can just tune in with this totality of presence in this everyday moment, this everyday ritual.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I am your host, Ashton Szabo. Today's show is all about ceremony, specifically how to recognize the sacred in everyday moments through ceremony. Joining us on the show today is Tehya Sky. She is a channel, a metaphysical and transformational guide, a writer, and an author. Her debut book, A Ceremony Called Life, When Your Morning Coffee is as Sacred as Holy Water, was recently released this spring, and she's here to share her insights about ceremony with us today. Sky, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
We're happy to have you. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about what got you so interested in ceremony.
Yeah, so I'd have to take you back to when I was working in the music industry in Los Angeles as a manager for bands and musicians. And essentially what happened was the job was no longer right for me. I felt completely cut off from myself, from this 24/7 work. And at the same time, I started to realize that my past was dominating my present moment. And a lot of patterns and pain was coming up inside of me. And so I made this pretty abrupt U-turn into discovering my spiritual journey and my true life, whatever that was, having no idea at the moment what it would be. And basically, the longer I went along on this path, the deeper I went, the more I came to discover the ceremonious nature of life. The further I went in my own deconditioning and deconstructing the patterns and the beliefs that were influencing me, the more I came to see the beautiful ritual of life and just became very inspired by it.
What does it mean to you to live a spiritual life?
A spiritual life. To live a spiritual life to me means to anchor our presence in everyday moments, in all of these little daily moments, from drinking our coffee and even challenging moments like having an argument with our loved ones, and bringing in that quality of presence into all of these opportunities that we have to essentially create the good visions of our lives. And what I mean by that is that we are really just so empowered to create our lives as we really mean to. And to me, spiritual practice and living our life as a spiritual practice is about looking at what is reflected to us through our experiences and looking at the way we see things to shift our behavior and make good choices that really support our lives and what we're really intending to create.
So aside from the dictionary definition of ceremony, what does ceremony mean to you?
To me, ceremony means that there is a sacred procession of moments happening. And it could be a wedding or even a funeral or a birth. But when I look at that significance of those moments and those experiences, like a birth, like a death, like a wedding, what happens is, for me, I see that sacredness in all of life. And so Yeah, while a ceremony is traditionally and typically thought of in terms of these experiences that are formal, what I invite people in the book, what I invite the readers to look at is how all of life is actually this ceremony and how we have these rituals every day, whether it's our coffee or just the fact that the sun is rising every day and it's setting every night, and we always have this fresh start. And to me, that is just so completely ceremonious.
And how does ceremony, whether it's kind of the more formal ceremony that you mentioned or kind of this broader concept of ceremony, how does it help us to live a more spiritual life?
That's a really good question. And to me, ceremony, this consideration of ceremony, helps us to live a more spiritual life, because when we consider these moments of ceremony that I just described, we might also consider how when we're in these significant experiences, we're more present and we're more connected to the meaning that is before us. And we're also more willing to be touched, and we're more vulnerable and raw. And when we just zoom out and look at that applicability to all of life and consider how all of life is actually this ceremony, then perhaps we might bring that essence of presence and vulnerability to everyday life. And for that, we may actually start connecting and seeing the deep meaning that is before us.
And in that realm of connection, it's often seemingly the ego that can sometimes obstruct that or get in the way. And a lot of Indian stories and philosophy, that the ego is front and center as this thing to either learn how to overcome or destroy or work with. In your book, you talk about befriending the ego in the mind. How does creating ceremony help us to do that, to befriend the ego and the mind?
Because in ceremony, all is sacred. And what I talk about in the book is how the divine created us. We are divine essence itself, having this human experience. And no part of us is unholy. No part of us. Whether it's the mind that just won't stop talking, or it's the tension of the ego, everything is sacred. And so when we just take a deep breath and honor and acknowledge that all of these aspects of ourselves are actually precious and they're not here to hurt us, then we're in a position to shift our relationship with them. So what I see is that it's not about getting rid of the ego and never having the mind influence us. And what I also see is that when we buy into the idea that we should get rid of our ego or our mind, we can become a bit violent with ourselves and also delude ourselves when we believe that it's even possible. Because yes, for some people there is a mysterious fate or dharma that some people have where they express that their ego is gone, and perhaps that is true and that is all beautiful and all good. But for most of us, what I see to be beneficial and supportive and true is to simply work on shifting our relationship with the ego so that it's not guiding our every decision and move, but rather supporting us as essentially a vehicle for projecting our visions and our intentions in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a yoga teacher, I know a lot of students get caught up in this idea that they're kind of waiting for this magical moment that their mind will stop, like it won't be chatty, like that the ideal yogic state is somehow this like comatose state. But when really it's about kind of learning how to navigate the mind when it comes up and use the mind as a tool rather than be a slave to its various impulses. And that's, I think, what gets a lot of people in trouble, because we're so used to just believing everything that the mind says, then we get caught up in this trap that we kind of lose the scope of. It's really there for us as a tool instead of something that's there to kind of dominate or control us. Kind of in that same realm, though, in your book, you talk about mastery versus perfectionism. And I'm curious to get your opinion of really how does perfectionism inhibit our ability to create ceremony out of our lives, and how can we really address that obstacle that it creates?
When I consider perfectionism in relation to our spirituality and how we treat ourselves, what I often see is how hard we get on ourselves when we don't behave in a way that we think we should, or we don't see things as purely as also we think we should. And all of these little moments where we're rejecting ourselves because we think we should be another way, or a more perfect way, you could say. These are little acts of violence, and they're keeping us separate from ourselves and our wholeness. And so when I look at perfectionism and the beauty, really, of our imperfectionism, what I see is that our state of growing is totally inclusive of all of these moments of what you could say is imperfection.
And how does that kind of tie back in then? Because in our culture, mastery or this idea of exceptionalism or always kind of thriving and doing all this great stuff, it's a big part of our culture. But again, that area or that air of perfectionism tends to sabotage a lot of that. How do we classify mastery of ourselves or our lives and working towards that without getting knocked aside through perfectionism?
Yeah, exactly. And to that, I say that mastery includes our imperfection. And that when we're working with all of life as a spiritual practice, or as the metaphor, as a metaphor of the ceremony, then what happens is when we have these moments where either we act out, or there's a reaction, or there's pain coming up, or any of the various ways that we feel like we fall out of presence, or we fall into old emotions and pain, rather than just rejecting ourselves and almost chalking off that moment as just meaningless because it shouldn't have happened and I need to be just perfect. Rather than that, we work with it to bring that deeper sense of wholeness into our sight, into our feeling. And what I mean by that is that when these moments happen, we can either reject ourselves and stuff them down and continue to react even, really, or we can take a moment with ourselves and say, what is this showing me about myself? Where do I have an opportunity here to cleanse the mirror of perception and see this moment more innocently? And what is within myself that is asking for my attention and my resolution? And when we interact with life like that, we are essentially continuously dropping into this deeper sense of wholeness where our divinity is merging with our humanity and really working with life for the ceremony it is, for the opportunity it is. And to me, that's mastery. That's the juice, right? It's working with every moment for our betterment.
Now, the subtitle of your book is When Your Morning Coffee is as Sacred as Holy Water, which I love. And obviously, your book covers a lot of kind of the metaphor of ceremony, of making a ceremony out of your everyday acts and life so that you can recognize the sacred. But I want to kind of draw as well into this realm of what's the difference or perhaps what are the potential benefits or drawbacks between simply like waking up every day and recognizing that taking a shower can be a ceremony and a ritual and doing it from those everyday acts, but as well contrasted against either creating something out of thin air that you call a ceremony to remind you of the sacred, or perhaps adopting another culture's ritual and ceremony. I read that you were involved in the Native American moon dance. Obviously, that's something that's probably a little bit more foreign from our everyday aspects of the culture. I've adopted personally a lot of rituals and ceremony from the East and from India. What would you say are some of those things that might help us or hinder us by either choosing one or the other, or obviously not that we have to choose one or the other, but what might be some of the things we'll encounter when we take one path versus the other?
For me, it's really about bringing it back to the simplicity, yeah? So we have so many different options of ceremonies or rituals or different practices that we can get into in our lives. But when we just bring it back to the simplicity of how we feel, then perhaps we can just simply feel what is right for us, what is right for me today. Do I feel today to sit down in meditation and chant mantras? Do I feel to go for a walk? Do I feel to go participate in a sweat lodge or a more formal ritual of another culture? And when we follow this intuition that we have within ourselves, then we're constantly unfolding a deeper truth within ourselves. And so I think that the only drawback really is when we approach it mentally and we think, oh, what should I be doing? Or, oh, I haven't done this in 4 weeks and I need to do it because I'm out of practice. And while that may be true sometimes, I think the deeper question really rests in what is right for me today and how can I serve myself today? And when we start to ask ourselves, I think what we often see, and I know for myself, what we see is that we have opportunities in all of these little moments, from being just completely present while we're taking a shower and feeling that water cleansing us on so many levels, to realizing that, oh my, it's a full moon tonight, so why don't I go sit outside with her and just be in prayer and be present with that beautiful energy? Or I feel actually to go to yoga class and that's where my being is taking me today. And actually, just to tie it back to the overarching ceremony of life, this is just really keeping us in that flow with ourselves, which to me, the more and more I look at everybody that I've worked with and people I've met along the way and myself and my friends, to me, this is really what's bringing us back into the sense of wholeness within. Is just constantly taking it back to what do I need in this moment?
What are your feelings, though? Because I know I lived on an island in Thailand for a number of years, and there was plenty of spiritual communities there, lots of yoga schools. And one of the things that I did encounter often, though, was a similar mindset to kind of what you're speaking of always going with the flow. But the negative side to that, or the dark underbelly of that, was that people were extremely ungrounded and they had a really hard time navigating life because it was the thought, well, what I'm always supposed to be doing is what I'm feeling right now. But our feelings can betray us. The mind can trick us. We can be a slave to impulse at that point. So where does discipline, or perhaps there's a different word you'd prefer for it, but where does that insight and that perspective to recognize that, like, hey, I'm waking up this morning, I don't feel like getting up to do a yoga practice, but I know that it would benefit me and help me throughout the rest of my day if I were to wake up right now and do a yoga practice. So where's the middle ground or the line that can connect those two things?
I'm actually so glad you asked, because this is so important to talk about, especially in the context of our discussion and in honoring how important the flow is, or rather the way that I look at it is just really what we need on a moment-to-moment basis. And so, to your question, what I would say is that there's totally this tendency that we can see to get ungrounded when we just start following our flow everywhere, for sure. And to me, how I see it is that we have certain commitments that we make in our lives, right? Like, if we're in a relationship, if we feel to be monogamous with one person, and that is truly our truth and what we have discovered is right for us, then sometimes we're going to find relationships is just like the easiest place to look at this, right? Sometimes we're going to find that we're frustrated, or we have exit doors in our minds open of fantasies about leaving or fantasies about a more perfect relationship. So perhaps some days when we're really frustrated with our partner, it doesn't necessarily feel like it's in our flow to be with them. But when we look deeper within ourselves, what we find are deeper commitments that extend into time, extend into the future. And actually, our manifestation of them and our good creation of them is totally dependent on our staying with them. So I think what it takes is that discernment and also that groundedness of looking honestly at ourselves and saying, okay, am I just not feeling like getting out of bed and going to yoga because, I'm really tired, or I'm really tired today, or, I had a rough night last night and I just feel like being by myself this morning, or, all the different things that we can think of and that can come up. And asking ourselves, what is more true for my long-term vision of my life? And what is the deeper feeling here? What is beneath the resistance? What is beneath the desire to check out? And often what we'll find is that, yeah, indeed, there was just resistance, or there was this desire to check out, but that longer term commitment is more true and more important to us.
And how would you recommend for people, do you have advice or an actual practice that's going to help people connect back into that, to check in, to say wow, is it just a matter of stopping and reflecting, or do you have some practices that you suggest or a way of addressing that?
Well, this is a really good question. And in my experience, this actually has a lot to do with the practice of meditation and just bringing that meditation into everyday life, and the courage to look at ourselves honestly, and to also realize that and I'm trying to bring actually quite abstract vision that I have right now into words. And what this has so much to do with, from my vision, my perspective, is the separation between our divine selves and our human selves. And I think when we're sort of leaning more into, I am just this divine spirit and my human being, my human self is just an illusion and this life is going to end and I'm only spirit, there's a bit of an ungroundedness. And I think when we're in that space, we can feel it. Because I know for myself, I've been there before, and I could feel that I was just more in that spirit zone, and that's where I wanted to be. And I could see that sort of disregard for the human elements of life. And so a good way to check in with ourselves, to invite ourselves into a deeper space of wholeness and truth, is to see if we are rejecting our humanity. Because the human being often does have these long-term commitments, and they're not wrong. They're not wrong, because a lot of our long-term commitments are coming from what is truly sacredly right for us in these lives, from the divine perspective. And so looking at where we fall on the scale of the human self or the divine self, and checking out, okay, am I more just like go, 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 go from the mind, reactive, or am I really located within my divine self and kind of disregarding my humanity? Which side do I tend to lean on? And then bringing that back into an integration through watching our through watching our perception of things, through watching our patterns and perhaps our tendency to wander when it's no longer serving us. And really, yeah.
And you mentioned something too about kind of speeding through life, and that's something that really has been very evident and clear to me. I lived abroad for a number of years. I was living most of that time on a little tropical island, spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia as a whole, in India and South America, where things were much slower paced. I mean, you go to cultures like India or in Bali, where everything is infused with this sacred ceremony. Like every part of their life is slowed down to a very purposeful interaction. And I think that it's something that's very much missing from our modern culture, where we're so busy. It's all about getting that next paycheck, the next job, the next thing, the next task. In the so-called sort of spiritual communities, it's all about like, that next spiritual assignment or that next thing that I've overcome or done or this or that. How I've helped myself or bettered myself, or if I've gone to this retreat or that retreat, and it's all just this fast-paced stuff. And I think part of the beauty of ceremony and the work that you're doing is recognizing how by slowing down our lives and recognizing the sort of ceremonious nature and ritualistic nature of things, we can connect to that deeper sense of spirit. We're all doing rituals all the time. It's just a matter of like, how conscious are we of them? Brushing your teeth every day is a ritual, but are you sitting there mindlessly brushing your teeth while you're thinking about, oh my gosh, I got all this crap to do today and I didn't get enough sleep and this and that? Or are you recognizing the opportunity to connect deeply with yourself in the moment through brushing your teeth? And I think that's where making or being more consciously aware of the ceremony of life really does connect us into spirit, the way that you were saying. I'd like to kind of pull this into very kind of nuts and bolts, like easy examples for our listeners of, okay, I kind of get it, but how can I do it? Or what are some examples of? So I was hoping you could kind of give us some examples. I thought of 3 kind of basic everyday acts. And while everyone has to kind of go in and create their own, perhaps, a way of dealing with this, I'm curious to hear how you would approach these moments a little more ceremoniously to draw yourself closer to that sense of spirit. So let's take the one that I just used, brushing your teeth. How can someone take that and make that into a ceremony that makes them more connected to the divine?
Yeah, this is another question that I'm really glad you asked, because this is something that I talk about so often. These small and overlooked examples we have to drop into that ceremonious nature of life. And so, for example, brushing our teeth. We can either brush our teeth totally distracted, thinking about all the things we have to do that day, right? Or we can just slow down for even 1 minute, and we can feel the toothbrush in our mouths. We can hear the sound of it brushing our teeth. We can taste the toothpaste on our tongue. We can just be so completely present for even 1 minute. And what happens is that when we bring this sense of presence into these mundane moments, we are essentially anchoring our presence in our bodies to be there with us throughout the day as well. And this is really what life as a spiritual practice is about. And if I could give you another example, the one that I always talk about, and it's also in the subtitle of the book, is drinking our coffee. And people who drink coffee especially, this is totally a ritual. The morning coffee is like one of the most important parts of the day. And so we can either drink that coffee, again, distracted, yelling at our kids, making a list of stuff we need to do that day, or for even just 1 or 2 or 3 sips, we can slow down, feel the warmth of the coffee on our tongue, feel and detect the taste, feel it going down our throats, feel ourselves swallowing it. We can just tune in with this totality of presence in this everyday moment, this everyday ritual. And perhaps to take it even a step further, in this moment of presence, we can also feel gratitude for this warm cup of coffee and for this new day. And just as I mentioned with the teeth brushing, this is the same opportunity to anchor our presence in our bodies and to bring that ceremony into all of life, to see it, to feel it, and to know it.
And very much kind of what you're talking about mirrors at least some approaches to yoga, especially through the physical practice of essentially using the sensory experience instead of viewing it as a distraction, rather using it as a vehicle to connect deeper to the self. And I think that's a really, really important part, as you said, of learning how to take our human experience and use it as a vehicle to connect to the divine. As well, though, what is your suggestion in terms of, ritual and ceremony tends to, let's say, traditionally be infused with self-imposed created meaning that I'm moving my cup this way because moving it that way signifies something special to me. And this is sometimes where things are lost in translation when we do adopt other people's rituals. We don't have the same meaning behind them, so we kind of miss what actually links us to the divine. If someone wanted to create a ritual out of something in their lives, and we can use the coffee as an example. So you gave us some great examples of the sensory experience drawing us into the moment to sort of feel the sacredness of it. But are there other ways that we could go about that are a little less perhaps from the sensory side, but more the meaning side, where the way that you start to wash your cup a certain way to prepare yourself for it, that you're grinding your beans maybe by hand instead of in a machine to get that experience with it for the purpose of, hey, my life is too fast. I'm always grinding beans with the machine. It's loud on my ears. It's sort of intrusive. So I'm going to grind them slowly with my hand because I have that time. And it means to me that I'm taking the time to slow it down. What are some other ways that you might suggest that people could add something to their experience that has meaning to them to help further this connection to the divine?
Yeah. There are so many different ways that we can do this. And I think the most important thing to say is to remember that whatever we feel is right for us is what we ought to explore. And so I really like your examples actually of manually grinding the coffee beans rather than just putting them in the machine. That's actually a really beautiful example. For myself, I think, and I'm just sort of collecting different examples right now and just pulling them into words. So even when we take a shower, and it's still always coming back to presence and slowing down, right? Like, as we squeeze the shampoo into our hands, really squeeze it a little bit slower. Just not to be mindless with it, rather to be really mindful with these little moments that we have. Squeeze it a little bit slower, notice its texture, notice its color, and to put it in our hair mindfully. And another example that I really like, because I think it's really easy and applicable to all of us, is we can make up our mind to walk to our cars mindfully. So it could be that every step we're taking towards the car as we leave the house is really slow and deliberate and filled with the love of our hearts. There are so many ways to bring this ceremony into our lives. And of course, there are other really meaningful rituals and ceremonious moments we can have. Like, one of my favorite things to do is to write down on a piece of paper that which I feel I'm ready to let go of. Or it could be a belief or a pattern or a memory. And I write it down on a piece of paper and I burn it. I give it back to the fire. I give it back to God. And this is another really powerful way that we can interact with the ceremony of life and the opportunity we have really to be tuning in with this divinity for the betterment of our human experience.
And I think that's a great example too. That's actually something we do in a lot of our yoga trainings, is kind of moving through the end, whatever the particular scope of that training is. There'll often be a ceremony at the end of writing things down, putting them in the fire, because it creates a ceremony and ritual around basically a map for the mind of how we're going to kind of integrate, how we're going to adjust to that conscious thing of like, okay, I want to give this up, or I want to encourage more of this in my life, or I want to go in this direction. And it allows us that interaction that keeps us connected to perspective, to that, as we talked about earlier, of like, well, am I waking up and just feeling lazy right now, and that's why I don't want to go to yoga? Or do I know that it's actually going to benefit me to go anyways? If we don't have that grander scheme of things at play, it's much easier to get ungrounded and kind of flop around through life just based on impulse and desire versus that greater picture and greater connection. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of amazing things here for people to look into. And as you said, there is no one perfect way of doing it. The really most important thing is that people are connecting to themselves in a way that makes sense for them. You don't want to grab a statue that has no meaning to you and stick it on your altar because, oh, you heard it's spiritual. The things there are the things that have deep meaning to you. I can use the example of, I know that when my altar gets a little messy and dust collects on it, that's usually a sign that I'm not doing the things in my own life to really connect to life. Like I'm not taking care of myself. I'm not, perhaps I'm not doing my yoga practice enough, or perhaps I'm not nourishing my relationships with my family. A lot of my objects on the altar represent aspects of my interaction with life and with my family. So if my statue is getting dusty, well, then where in my relationships is there dust accumulating? And even the act of washing the statues, cleaning the statues becomes a reminder then for me not to have clean statues, but to instead recognize that the cleaning of those statues is symbolic of the time and energy that I'm putting into my relationships or whatever those particular objects on the altar might represent. And I think that allows us both the moment-to-moment sensory experience as well as sort of a more conscious participation in acts that will link us back to. And that also to me connects us to a creative part of our mind. So it's not just a receptive feeling, but rather we can project through our creativity, through our imagination, new ways that are going to connect us back to spirit, back to life itself. And so I really appreciate all of your insights on that.
Yeah, that was a really, really powerful recap. Yeah. Yes.
Where can we find out more about you? Where is the best place for people to get your book, to find out about the work that you're doing? I mean, you've got your website. Maybe you could tell us about that. I know you got videos on there, all that good stuff. Where can we find out more about Sky?
So visit me at tehyasky.com, which is TEHYASKY.com. And I've got some good events coming up soon. There's something coming up in San Francisco, which is just amazing. It's called Cathartic. Come visit if you're in town. I would love to have you. And there's also an online workshop coming up in October called Rediscovering the Sacredness of Life. And it's a month long, and we meet once a week online. And I'm really excited about that. So, yeah, that's open to everyone and anyone, no matter where you are, you can join. So come discover more on the website. And yeah, I'm also pretty active on Facebook, so you can find me there at /Tehya Sky.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, Sky, thank you so much for being on the show today. Really appreciate your insight. I hope people will go and check out your book. I've been able to read through a large portion of it before our chat. It's a great book, so people definitely go check it out. You can find it through your website, through Amazon, through all the places that books are sold and things like that. So again, thank you so much to everyone listening today. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your attention. We hope you have a deeply present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. Please go over to iTunes, write a review, let us know what you think. It helps us in creating new content for all of you. It also helps new listeners get a sense of what to expect from the show. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.